Many say that the Lotus Sutra is very difficult to understand. And for the most part, it could be said that that is true. I am Myokei Caine-Barrett, Shonin. I'm the guiding teacher and head priest of Myokei Temple in Houston, Texas. I am also the bishop of the Nichiren Shu Order of North America. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Lotus Sutra and the various practices associated with the Lotus Sutra. I have been practicing this Buddhism since I was about 11 or 12 years old. So it's now about 50 years or so. And I'm really interested in telling you about this because I think there's so many misconceptions about what we practice, why we practice, and how we do it. It is a beautiful practice. It is one that can be so enriching in your life if you are open to it. And I think that it's time to clear up some of the misconceptions about Buddhism labeled Nichiren Buddhism or Lotus Sutra Buddhism. It's a teaching that is just absolutely wonderful, and one who associates themselves with the Lotus Sutra will find that they gain knowledge and wisdom beyond anything I think that anybody has thought possible. But it's wisdom and knowledge about oneself. So let's begin today talking about the Lotus Sutra. What is it? Where did it come from? The Lotus Sutra, also known in Sanskrit as Saddhamma Pandurika Sutra, is thought to be the highest teaching in the Nichiren school. It may not be considered so high in the rest of Buddhism. When one thinks that its beginnings are in India, I believe there are very few commentaries in India about the Lotus Sutra. And it traveled from India to China, where Kumarajiva was one of the first to translate the Lotus Sutra into Chinese. He was thought to be such a gifted translator that he was imprisoned so he could translate the Lotus Sutra. At any rate, the sutra then traveled to Japan and possibly to Korea. And it is in this area, East Asia, where the Lotus Sutra achieves its stature as one of the major teachings of the Buddha. The Lotus Sutra was transmitted to Japan in about 500 BCE, and Prince Shotoku is thought to be one of the commentators of the Lotus Sutra and also used the Lotus Sutra as a foundation for governance. The Lotus Sutra was very highly prized. It was used as a form of literature. People copied it. Art rose around it. And it was found in many monasteries and convents throughout Japan. It was extremely well regarded. In Chinese, the Lotus Sutra is known as Miao Fa Lin Hua Xing. The Japanese pronunciation is Myoho Renge Kyo, and in English it is simply known as the Lotus Sutra. Now, one of the reasons that the Lotus Sutra is so important is because it is one of the early sutras to talk about the Buddha's enlightenment in such a way that all beings could achieve that same enlightenment. And indeed, the Buddha's advent was simply to cause all beings to enter the way and quickly become Buddhas. And one could do this simply by being exposed to the Lotus Sutra, by reading it, by learning from it, by copying it. So you found in Japan tons of people copying the sutra in order to gain merit, in order to advance their lives. And if one thinks about this carefully, one could really see that it was not a teaching that was available to everyone. Because when you think of having the ability to copy, to read, to share it, to create art, then you're talking about a class of people who have the resources in order to do that. And so it was a practice at that time for those who were well equipped financially and with the resources to take the time in order to promote the teaching. It was also a teaching that was well regarded specifically by women. And in the many convents, one of the major practices was writing or copying and making art around the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra also was the first teaching to talk about the one vehicle rather than three vehicles. And when we talk about the vehicles, we're talking about the Shravaka, Pratyeka, and Bodhisattva vehicles. The Lotus Sutra teaches that there is only one vehicle, of which all of them are a part. The sutra also addresses the timeless, eternal nature of Shakyamuni, the eternal Buddha, and suggests that all other Buddhas are manifestations of the eternal Buddha, that he neither is born nor does he die. He is always in this world continuously. The sutra establishes the 5 ways of practice: to receive and keep, to read, recite, to copy, and expound. Now, what does that mean? That means upon hearing the sutra or being given the sutra, that you keep to the teachings of the sutra. And that means to study it carefully, to read it continuously. And that's the second part of the practice, to read it. That you read it from cover to cover throughout the entirety of your life. Now, one may think that's an incredible goal to read a sutra for your entire life. One of the practices is to read a chapter a day every month, so that every month you are reading the entire sutra. And by this continuous exposure to the teachings contained therein, one begins to really understand and is able to keep the sutra. Reciting the sutra means to chant the sutra in its entirety or just in parts, or simply by chanting the title, in either Shindoku, which is the faith language, which is the Japanese pronunciation of Chinese, or in one's native language. And there's nothing, I think, more beautiful than hearing the sutra chanted in one's own language, be it English or Spanish or Italian. It is quite beautiful. And when one is able to chant in one's own language, then the relationship with the sutra becomes even more profound, because one is able to actually hear the words and capture its essence. The difference with chanting in Shindoku is that one really doesn't necessarily understand what the words are saying, but one does capture the rhythm, the flow, and the sound of the sutra being chanted. And all of these work together to implant the sutra, in your life. To expound means to share the sutra with everyone, not simply through words, but through one's life. And that goes back to keeping the sutra again. If you expound the sutra through your words, your thoughts, your deeds, then you are keeping to the sutra. Lastly, a very beautiful practice is copying the sutra. And this can be done, again, in one's native language, just simply copying it word for word. Or one can learn how to copy in sumi, in Japanese calligraphy, or Chinese calligraphy. Because when you copy the words, the characters of the sutra, you are indeed also writing the words into your life. Now, the Lotus Sutra is a teaching that I believe it can be said that all Buddhists revere. Indeed, chapter 25 of the Lotus Sutra is well regarded around the world. It is known as the Kanzeon chapter, or Kanon chapter, or Avalokiteshvara, and the hearer of the world's cries. And this is a chapter that can be chanted or recited with followers around the world. It is one chapter that I believe you'll find important in the Zen tradition and many other traditions that come out of the Japanese Buddhist tradition. I think Jodo is probably the only one that doesn't recite it, the Jodo Shu schools. Many say that the Lotus Sutra is very difficult to understand. And for the most part, it could be said that that is true. The Lotus Sutra consists of 28 chapters. That's one version. There's another version that includes chapters in the beginning and at the end. The one in the beginning is known as the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, and the one at the end is the Sutra on Meditation. That particular version of the Lotus Sutra is known as the Threefold Lotus Sutra. It is also a very popular version of the Lotus Sutra. The other version of only 28 chapters is found in various forms. There's the version that is popular in the Nichiren schools, which is the version done by Senchu Murano, a Japanese priest in the Nichiren tradition. There's also the Kern version, which is an English version, which is not quite the same as the Murano version or the Watson version, which comes later. Indeed, there are many different versions of the Lotus Sutra, and some new ones have come out just recently. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in reading these is to obtain copies of all of them, because in reading the various versions, one can possibly get deeper into what the pure intention of the sutra is all about. I do admit that my favorite version is the Murano version because he outlines the way of practice for bodhisattvas very clearly, and some parts are just lyrical in their translation. In particular, the part that says, "I am always thinking, how can I cause all living beings to enter the way and quickly become Buddhas?" The Lotus Sutra is called Zuijii, namely because it expounds the true mind of the Buddha. Since the Buddha's mind is so great, even if one does not understand the profound meanings of the sutra, one can gain innumerable merits by just reading it. Just as a mugwort among the hemp plants grows straight, and a snake in a tube straightens itself, if one becomes friendly with good people, one's mind, behavior, and words become naturally gentle. Likewise, the Buddha thinks that those who believe in the Lotus Sutra become naturally virtuous. To sum up, the Lotus Sutra introduces the doctrine of the one Buddha vehicle. It also defines its goal as the Buddha's enlightenment and the ability of all beings to access that enlightenment. It also addresses the eternal, timeless nature of the Buddha and the fact that all other Buddhas are manifestations of the eternal Buddha. Finally, the sutra establishes 5 ways of practice: to receive and keep, to read, recite, copy, and expound the teachings.